are to have so many of you join us for Dr. Berg's presentation. We're equally delighted that this program is co-sponsored with the Jay's Jewish Book Festival, and I want to welcome Bob Williams, the co-chair of the Jewish Book Festival, who's going to introduce our guest speaker.
Well, I am so excited to represent the Jewish Book Festival today. And I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Nancy to everybody. Nancy Berg categorizes herself as a St. Louisan by choice. Nancy is professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author of Exile from Exile, Israeli Writers from Iraq, More and More Equal, the literary works of Sami Michael, and assorted essays on Hebrew and Arabic literature. She has served as president of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew. With co-editor Naomi Sokoloff, she won the 2019 National Jewish Book Award for anthologies and collections, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew. Their most recent collaboration, since 1948, Israeli Literature in the Making, has just been published by SUNY Press. And now I would love to introduce Nancy Berg.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And it's really a pleasure. And I apologize for not having made the first date. I had jury duty. And so I'm really delighted that you were willing to reschedule this. I'm going to try and share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to go through that hopefully will be fun to see. Let's see. There it is. Okay. I come from the field of literature, which I chose, or which chose me many years ago, in large part because I like stories. So if you let me, I'm gonna start with a story. And I'm starting with a story that opens the book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew. And it starts out that a number of years ago, I was in Texas for a conference, and in the evening went out with a few colleagues, all of whom were Israeli. We were discussing our plans from the back seat of the cab. The driver was an immigrant from Ghana. Unable to contain his curiosity, he asked us what language we were speaking. Hebrew, we answered. Seeing his confusion, one of the others added helpfully, like in the Bible. Hebrew? He giggled. Like in the Bible? And I could see that he was picturing all of us as characters from the Old Testament, having left our camels at the well. And it reminded me once again what an extraordinary feat the revival of Hebrew is, to take a language that lay virtually dormant for 2,000 years and turn it into the mother tongue of millions, the shared vernacular for immigrants from many countries, a source of national identity, and a fount of cultural achievement. And the revival of the Hebrew language in the last couple of centuries was improbable, unprecedented, and at least as of now, unreplicated. And so I want to share my enthusiasm for the language and its backstory, and to illustrate some of its richness and talk about some of the challenges that I've encountered in the study. But first, let me start with the idea of language and language death and extinction. And so if we compare Hebrew to some of its friends, we can see that these other languages that have been threatened with extinction have many fewer speakers. And the L1 is if it's the primary language, the L2 means that it's their second language. And so you can see that Hebrew's doing a really bang-up job. And even though Hebrew, the language of the Bible, had been limited for centuries to the religious realm, to study and prayer, its vocabulary focused to fulfill liturgical functions and discuss legal matters, even so, it is unique in its dormancy. It could possibly have been considered a dead language or a living written language, but it was never really extinct because it was always being used. But there were no native speakers, and even the designation as living written language is questionable when one takes into account literacy rates. Few women were taught to read Hebrew, and rates of literacy among men varied over time, location, and class. So while today the revival of the language and its connection with the modern state of Israel seems both natural and inevitable, in reality it was neither. The re-territorialization of Hebrew was contrary. Of all the possibilities of language, it can be argued that it was the least likely choice. And I just want to show you some examples of other choices, but it's mostly due to Eliezer ben Yehuda and people like him that helped revive the language of Hebrew. There were more than a handful of other options that were more logical choices. German was the language of science and general enlightenment. French was the language that was thought of as the language of culture and diplomacy. Yiddish, of course, was the common language of many Jews from Eastern and Central Europe. For others, Russian was their mother tongue. The indigenous language was Arabic. The language of the rulers, the Ottoman Empire, Turkish. And then later, English because of British governance. All of those languages were more vital than Hebrew. They were more alive. At the beginning of this process, Hebrew was no one's mother tongue, and was not spoken in normal everyday conversation. The lexicon was limited to about 7,000 items, which compared to English, which may have like 1 million words. And most of the words had to do with prayer and study. There were no textbooks, no teachers, no grammars, and no precedent. In the history of humankind, no language that had been as inactive as Hebrew and for as long had ever been fully woken from its deep sleep. And so the story of the revival of Hebrew is often told as part of the Zionist narrative, but it's really in Eastern Europe where it began to flourish. And in Eastern Europe, the Tarbut Ivrit movement began. And here's an example. This was a Hebrew school in Bulgaria. Look at how many happy, healthy children are studying Hebrew in this school. Tarbut means culture in Hebrew, and the Tarbut movement was a network of secular Hebrew language schools in parts of the former Jewish Pale of Settlement, specifically Poland, Romania, Lithuania. They had something like 50,000 students enrolled by 1939. And with the advent of World War II, the movement came across the Atlantic. But here in America, there was already a history of Hebrew. According to some accounts, when the election of the choice of language of the new community being established was held on the Mayflower, Hebrew lost by a single vote. 30 years later, William Bradford, who some of you may remember was the governor of the Plymouth colony, he took up the study of Hebrew. He assumed that Hebrew was the language of the afterlife, of the heavens, and he wanted to be prepared to converse fluently with God and the angels. Clearly, he was an optimist. In fact, Hebrew was taught in American colleges from the start, and one of the principal subjects in the early curricula of Harvard and Yale, and so forth. Hebrew was required as a course of study. You needed to know Hebrew to be considered well-educated in colonial America. During the American Revolution, there was an effort to replace English, the language of the British oppressors, with Hebrew. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a growing population of European Jewish intellectuals, influenced by the Enlightenment and modern ideas of nationalism, were invested in Hebraism, the idea that the Hebrew language could be the key to Jewish national identity. By the 1920s, many of the immigrants helped to establish a network of Hebrew teachers' colleges book publishers, and summer camps. This is a store in Brooklyn, New York. American writers of Hebrew. There were many American writers of Hebrew. I'll give you a quick example. Avraham Regelson. Many of you might not know of his poetry, but you might know his niece, the writings of his niece, Cynthia Ozick. And this poem, engraved are thy letters in the structure of my world, beloved among languages, the seed in the grape, the clapper in the bell, your secrets I expressed, O Hebrew. He was a librarian, Hebrew teacher, wrote for the Yiddish press, and published books of Hebrew poetry, legends, and essays. Well, a few years ago, my colleague Naomi Sokoloff and I had a conference about why Hebrew matters, how Hebrew can save the humanities, all sorts of questions. And to go with the conference, we created the Museum of Profound Objects. And we gathered together our souvenirs of Israel, and all sorts of quirky things that were in Hebrew, through which we really saw our relationship with Hebrew. And in our quest for the authentic, we often found the suspect. But through this, we found teaching materials or office decor, objects that we put in a place of honor or in the back of a drawer. And we looked at it. The museum was really kind of phenomenal to us. It was a pop-up museum because it really did reflect the role of Hebrew in our lives. And here you see a t-shirt that says, I speak Hebrew, what's your superpower? Dictionaries, the ubiquitous notebook that we had in Hebrew school. There's a political pin in the background you might be able to see. Here you see that there's Scrabble in Hebrew. The original game, but with Hebrew letters, said the ad. The game where every word counts. And this pop-up museum was a gesture to the question of authenticity. This idea that we wanted materials that were authentic. And as Americans who were involved in the pursuit of Hebrew, we're often concerned with authenticity. And that was the subject of my contribution to the book and to the conference. And I started thinking about authentic materials, such as this menu, that we'd use to supplement our teaching. And for those of you who are Hebrew scholars and can read this quickly, and if your screen is big enough, you might notice that there are words such as carpaccio and alcohol and other words that aren't really indigenous to the Hebrew language. And when I was preparing my original study, I was sent this video clip and an ad for these materials. And for teaching, they suggested that we have this tape on how to prepare sushi in Hebrew. And my initial reaction was, what would I do with a sushi rolling demonstration in Hebrew? How authentic is that? But then I found out that Tel Aviv was the third most populated city with sushi restaurants. So who am I to say what's authentic and what's not? The question of authenticity is complicated. Here's an example. Some of you may have seen this ad just a few years back at this time of the year. Lord & Taylor's was trying to wish all of their Jewish customers a happy Hanukkah. But unfortunately, because of just a couple of extra serifs, it really translates into something like her earlobe tag that died. Not the most successful outreach. Other infelicities of language include bad tattoos. And here are some are written backwards. The one that says tolerance, the blue on black letters, is certainly the word for tolerance in Hebrew, but backwards. The red on green that says sex was actually supposed to be the Red Sox. The word for the heart was supposed to say tahor, pure, but instead it looks like fluent, which is ironic since it's not fluent. And this was an example of things that were maybe not quite authentic, or maybe authentic but not quite accurate. So it's always a question about, some of you may feel it's always a question whether or not to get a tattoo anyway, or that it's questionable practice, but certainly to get a tattoo in a language you don't know, you really should trust whom you ask. Fortunately, this is an example that's a little bit more successful. Some of you may recognize this is Hunter Biden and his current wife, that he got a shalom, peace, hello, goodbye tattoo to match that of his wife's. Also South African in origin. So this question of authenticity and what is authentic language and what are authentic materials also have to do with our place in this role of Hebrew, what it means to be an American scholar of Hebrew. Who owns Hebrew? Who determines what is authentic? And I show you this grainy, faded photograph that it's a picture I took many years ago on my first trip to Israel. It shows two cherry red shapes encircling each other. As part of a group, a teen tour, I was on a visit to what was then known as the Museum Af al Pi Chen, the Museum of Nevertheless. Today, the place is known as the Clandestine Immigration and Naval Museum. Personally, I like the original name better. Af al Pi Chen is a conjunctive phrase that belongs to the group of conjunctions that mean the opposite of expected. Nevertheless, although, even if, despite, even despite that. It is almost the conjunctive equivalent to the word davka, a Hebrew word, an interjection that contains the possibility of contrariness and means something like actually, specifically, unexpectedly. Davka is one of those words that can't be easily translated, a word that is what it means, as slippery and contrary as possible. While sometimes people try to explain it as especially, the English term isn't equivalent because it's missing the very ornery nature of the word. The aspect, maybe essence, that makes it untranslatable, refuses to comply with the human need to translate. Davka and the phrase Af al Pi Chen also capture a characteristic of the Hebrew language and those who speak it. The language, stubborn in its existence and persistence, spurns its logical death after centuries of limited use. This is an impossible story in which a language survives against all odds, and despite having had no land in which to root until recently. A religious and juridical idiom relegated to sacred texts, legal documents, and study has blossomed into a lusty, lyrical, and incredibly supple language. In many ways, these two expressions encapsulate the language, its history and nature, and in many ways, they also reflect my own experience with Hebrew. This contrary relationship may have started even before I failed the placement test for the entrance to a high school program in Hebrew. The then dean of the high school program told me that, despite that, he would nevertheless let me in. But, he added, I would never make it through. So only the memory of that interaction and my own sense of afal of nevertheless, kept me from quitting many times. It would probably help any language learner to have a spark of davka and a slice of afal to help him or her persevere through conjugations, advanced rhetoric, and the pursuit of fluency. But I think it's especially appropriate to us lomdei ivrit, Hebrew learners. Those red shapes I saw at the entry of the museum on my first visit to Israel turn out to be a sculpture called Kesher Hadorot, Connection Between Generations, by the artist Yitzchak Danziger. At that time, I didn't know what it was, but I loved the sculpture at first sight, and I loved the name of the museum. And I've continued to love the struggle of learning this language of Davka and nevertheless. And I'm pleased to share that with you. And I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand or you can type in the chat box.
I have a quick question.
Hi, Max.
Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation. I had read your book, and main objective reading the outstanding material you presented on Hebrew was so to motivate me to learn. I have 2 Israeli granddaughters, and thank God, striving in their ability to learn language at a young age. And I don't feel confident that I'm ever going to keep up with them. Any advice? And one quick question. I thought Yehud is connection. So you said the name of the museum had a different name about connection. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, it wasn't the name of the museum, it's the name of that sculpture, which is Kesher. And Kesher means connection. Yichud is more unity. But even so, more than one word can mean more than one thing, right? As for advice about learning, I would say be kind to yourself. Don't, it can be hard to learn a language. And I think as we have more things going on in our heads, it's even harder. You know, when we're little kids and we don't have much going on in our heads, it's a lot easier, but we have a lot of memories and a lot of connections and so forth, and a lot of things we have to do and responsibilities. So I think just be kind to yourself and you know, that bit by bit, word by word or phrase or function, and keep listening to it. I would just surround myself with Hebrew as much as I could, as much as it's a pleasure. Once it's not a pleasure, stop before it's not a pleasure. Because if it's a pleasure, you'll want to keep doing it. And if it feels like a burden, you won't.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the encouragement. There's some great apps I listen to, and they are pleasurable, and I love the music. So I'm hoping through listening to the music, it'll help too.
Yeah, and if there's a great app, let me know what they are.
You know them. If you leave can I contact you? I'll make sure I get it for Judy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Because people are always asking me, and I
have them on my phone. They're amazing. They're don't worry, I'll send them because maybe she can put it in the follow-up.
Thank you.
I can do that.
Thank you.
Shulamit, do you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Nancy, I was so delighted to see that you were presenting not Hebrew, but about Hebrew. And because that is the issue. I was in Hebrew Academy 1st through 4th grade. So I fell in love with Hebrew by being nurtured in a small classroom and getting the leads in all the plays, etc. But what I've come to understand now after trips to Israel and Israeli citizenship and some people on the call know that I try to teach Hebrew every now and then, is what is a good source or resource for newer words that are being canonized, and if for lack of another word. I know that the hardest words to read in Hebrew letters are the words in the newspapers that are like informatia. And by the time you go in for, to, oh, that's information. So what's the best way to find new words and translations?
So the best place is to go to the source, to the Hebrew Language Academy. And they do have websites and they do have lists of new words. The downside of that is that not all of the words are adopted. So one of my favorite words is ya'efet, which has the sound of ayef in there and af. And ya'efet is the fatigue you get from flying. Ayef is fatigue or tiredness. Af is to fly. And the fatigue you get from tiredness, like jet lag. But you'll hear most Israelis will say jet lag and not ya'efet. So some words get adopted. Teshir for tip might get adopted. Mashivon for answering machine finally got adopted instead of the electronic secretary, which sounded sexist as well as clunky. You never really know which words are going to take.
Right. It's like machshev from to think was the way they said computers in the 70s. And now everybody just says computer.
Well, no, a lot of people say machshev.
Oh, good, because maybe I've been listening to the wrong people.
But people, there are people who would say both. The same person might use both in different way, just alternate or whatever. But certainly there's a lot, in some ways there is a lot less English than there used to be in Hebrew. And as much as you can hear words like informatia, meaning information, and words that are cognates, there are perfectly fine words in Hebrew. And there are people who are very good about using the actual Hebrew.
Thank you.
Sure.
Nancy Susan Becker Kempinen, and how much Yiddish is spoken in Israel versus Hebrew?
Okay, I have no idea about percentages. I would say this much, but I don't really know percentages. Most Yiddish in Israel and in the States and elsewhere is spoken among the ultra-Orthodox. So Yiddish has gone from being that lusty, juicy kind of language that could do what Hebrew, the holy language, couldn't, to becoming the language of people who wouldn't want it to do the lusty, juicy things. And Hebrew has become the language of transgression and so forth. But there's certainly I would say at least 10% of the population in Israel speak a fluent Yiddish. How much of it is in mainstream? There's also a small but probably growing population of younger people, secular Jews in Israel, who kind of parallel the same group in the United States who have a cultural or academic interest in Yiddish.
Betty, I think you had a question.
Thanks, Nancy. It's interesting to me. I studied languages all through school, and I had never learned Hebrew until I went to Israel to visit, ended up staying and went to Ulpan. And I found that a very interesting way to learn a language, because I was in a classroom with new immigrants from 30 or 40 or 50 different countries. And so you learned Hebrew in Hebrew. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about the Ulpan movement and as a teaching languages.
Well, yeah, I think the Opan method is fantastic and phenomenal in many ways. And it sort of, not quite Berlitz, but the Hebrew in Hebrew movement, very, very important, very significant to the teaching of Hebrew, and put the teaching of Hebrew way ahead of other languages in the way they were taught, the grammar method and the translation method and the by rote. But unfortunately, what it did was we were so ahead that we didn't keep developing. And so in a way, Hebrew is not as far ahead of all the other languages as it used to be. But I think that learning a language in the language is ideal for most people. I think there are some people who are much better at grammar and translation or rote and memorization and all sorts of things, but it's a great way to learn. It should be backed up by a little bit more push on grammar, I think, as a little bit of a, I don't know. I guess I'm a little rigid about that, but I think it's a great way to learn a language.
Do we have any other questions?
On that note, what apps do you use for your students or inquiries when people ask you? I'm sure you're tired of hearing that. I know you said make it enjoyable, and the ones that I'll just tell you now are Mango is my favorite. I enjoy it more than Duo because Duo has no grammar. Mango has a little. And then the apps you can listen to, there's Israel Story, there's Everyday Hebrew, there's all these cute ones you can listen to. They'll plug in on your app screen Hebrew and they'll all come up. But which one, if you were a learner visually, because just auditory is not doing it to me. And I don't want to type on the keyboard because I don't have a keyboard. Maybe I need one.
Well, in terms of the Hebrew keyboard, there are things you can do. There are websites you can go on that will give you a Hebrew keyboard even if you don't have it without paying for anything extra. I don't actually teach beginning learners of Hebrew. I haven't for a number of years. So I am not up on apps, and I would not be using apps if I were teaching them. I would want them, they could supplement with whatever they want, but I would want them to be using the textbook or the texts and so forth. So I don't have wisdom about teaching Hebrew. Yeah, I don't have much to say about that.
Well, I'm going to try to talk to my granddaughters and keep that up in Hebrew, but I also know there's someone new at the J I'm reaching out to converse with in Hebrew. So maybe that'll help.
That's great. Yeah, certainly listening to things. So.
Nancy, may I take this in a different direction? Part of the subtext of this talk was about Hebrew's relevance to us in America. And some years ago, when I was at a program in Israel, one of the speakers bemoaned the fact that he thought the lack of emphasis of teaching Hebrew in America was a major cause of a divide between us and the Israelis. That in fact, as Israel becomes more fluent in Hebrew and more comfortable in Hebrew, and it's the primary language, our ability to communicate becomes challenged by the fact that so many of us in the United States are not comfortable nor sufficiently fluent. And so we're not familiar with the literature, we're not necessarily familiar with the culture that comes with that. And they thought that there was a significant lack of awareness in America about the need to emphasize Hebrew as a unifying bond between us and the Israelis. I'm just curious to hear your response to that.
I am not sure that is, I think I'd go in a different direction. I think for one thing, I think more and more Israelis speak a wonderful English, which was not true a generation ago. the English teaching in Israel has really improved. I think that the divide between Israel and American Jewry is much more, it has many more factors other than linguistic, although certainly language helps unify, helps unite and create connections. I think that it used to be that Israel was the sort of beneficiary of American Jewry's largesse, right? That they were sort of the younger sibling or the party in need, and that American Jews were, you know, the little blue JNF boxes and the pushki and the trees and so forth, that American Jews were giving to Israel when Israel was in great need. And Israel is no longer a quote third world nation or developing nation. Israel has a powerful economy on its own, sometimes in great distress, but it is its own power. And so Israel sees itself more as an equal among nations rather than the poor orphan child or the party in need. And so that has changed the balance. And that means that the relationship has to be renegotiated. On the other hand, when most Jews in America are from pluralistic communities or part of a pluralistic community, and that there's a faction in Israel that influences the governance not to include those Jews as part of the Jewish people, that creates more of a rift than any difference in language, I think, will. I don't know if that was clear, what I'm saying. I can't hear you, though. Are you on mute?
I still have this very profound memory of that presentation, and it's always gnawed at me as to the accuracy of it, and I think this has been helpful. So thank you.
Okay, all right. You're welcome. Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
Anything else you wanted to know about Hebrew?
Marion Shapiro has a question. You have to unmute, Marion.
I have a question about reading Hebrew literature in English and translation. There used to be the Brodsky Library where new Hebrew literature books would be available, but it's not available anymore. Is there a website for current writers, Israeli writers in fiction?
So I'm sorry about the library. I'm very
sorry about the library also.
And yeah, I regret that. I think it was one of the institutions that showed how special St. Louis is, the St. Louis Jewish community. And maybe we can revive it at some point. But in terms of a website, the ITHL.org, which is the Institute for Hebrew, no, ITHL, the Institute for the Translation of Hebrew Literature, has a list of many of the writers, not all of them, but many Israeli writers, and whether or not they've been translated into English.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So at least that's a place to start. And they have little blurbs about the writers and sometimes even little blurbs about each of the works.
I mean, I've read the ones that were big, like Amos Oz and Abi Yeshua and Bat Yagur and blah, blah, whatever. and the and the latest one, I can't think of her name, that wrote The Liar, and
Was that Gundar
Something-
Goshen?
huh?
Was that Gundar Goshen?
Yes,
So Ayala Gundar Goshen, she's written a number of things that are quite wonderful.
she's very good. So I like reading that sort of thing. And somebody who wrote The Hilltop, I can't think of.
Of Bone.
Yeah, so I guess that's what I'm thinking of.
So I think Jay, thank you. He put the URL, the website in the chat. And I think that's a good place to start. I think also if you look, even Amazon has, if you look up the books you like, they often suggest what other people have bought with those.
Okay,
I don't really know what to do about the Brodsky not being,
I know there.
Nancy,
yes.
it'll be a couple of years, but in the new construction that's being done for the Holocaust Museum, the library there will be a much smaller, but Brodsky Library will have a library in that new construction.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good to know.
Yes.
I wish it wouldn't be smaller.
It will be smaller, but if you look at the plans, you'll find it. You'll find the library there.
Thank you. I just always think the people of the book should, still have places for the book.
Madeline? Madeline?
I just wanted to recommend a site for learning Hebrew. I've tried several, and the one I like the best is called Malingua. It's very good, and they teach you a lot of grammar.
Oh, good.
And that's one of the reasons I've liked it. But I've stuck with it, and I really like it a lot.
That's
Could
great.
you write that in the chat, please?
It's great to hear all of these resources. There's so much available on the internet. So.
Well, and if someone thinks of something that comes to mind afterward, you can send it to me. You have my email, I believe. If not, I can send it to you. But then I can get it to Nancy and share it with the rest of the group that is here today, if you would like. Any other questions today? I'm not seeing any. Stephen, do you have anything?
No, the only thing I have to do is to say thank you so much for this thoughtful presentation. Thank you to the J for partnering with us through the Jewish Book Festival. We're delighted that you did this for us, and we look forward to welcoming you back on a future occasion to talk about your book that's just been published. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. So, and happy Hanukkah to those who celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank
You were
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.